This Grace Excels Bible study session, I pick up in John chapter 3, verse 14, and I bring two verses over from the previous study of John 3, verses 1 through 15, because I believe that that was the end of the previous section, 14 and 15, and it's unusual in John's Gospel because the dialogue, the conversation in chapter 3 between Nicodemus and Jesus, of which there were three questions or exchanges, as noted in the previous video, doesn't seem to have a real clear ending. I mentioned, and I'll highlight it again, that Jesus apparently says that as Moses in verse 14 lifted up the serpent in the wilderness, even so must the Son of Man be lifted up, so that whoever believes will in him have eternal life. It's exactly the phrase Son of Man that Jesus used at the end of John chapter 1. So there seems to be reason to believe that Jesus is saying these words in 14 and 15. I've left the break here in verse 16 because the most famous verse in all of the Bible, the most quoted, and rightly so, the gospel, is contained in just one verse. The question is, who said it? The quotation marks in this edition would seem to indicate that Jesus continues to talk. There's reason to believe that it's actually not Jesus talking at this point, but actually John reflecting, giving us some historical perspective on the continuation of the idea of the death of Jesus. The Son of Man must be lifted up, which could speak to one of two things, possibly three. One could consider that the Son of Man be lifted up could point to the fact of his crucifixion, that he would be lifted up on the cross, hung on the tree. The other is the resurrection, that he's lifted up from the grave. And the third would be the ascension from the Mount of Olives. The question, at least contextually, as Moses lifted up the serpent in the wilderness, which was on a staff, it's plausible that the same idea, the same as Moses did something, so the Father is going to do something, the Son be lifted up. It's a passive action. He's receiving the action of the verb. Then it could point to the cross. And it's anticipatory, the same as when Jesus said in John chapter 2, if you destroy this temple, I'll raise it up in 3 days. He was talking about his resurrection. Well, the destruction, of course, would be his death. So, following that, it appears that his crucifixion is in mind. If that's true, then the giving of the Son, which again can come in many forms, could come in just the incarnation as a baby, could come in his ministry, could come in his healing, could come in his gift for his death for the world. Don't want to go into great detail on this verse because it's for your own study. I just want to highlight what appears to be the structure of the passage as we go through the chapter. One of the important notes here in John chapter 3, verse 16 is that God's love motivated him to give, and the response that whoever believes in him shall not perish but have eternal life. I'd like to highlight that Jesus came to the Jews. He said that he came into his own, and his own received him not. This passage is real clear that God loved the world, not just the Jewish people. It's not exclusive for the Jews. And then whoever believes, we'll see throughout the New Testament that it's to the Jew first and also to the Greeks. So the emphasis is, in summary, that God's love motivated him to give his Son, his only begotten Son, which makes him unique. And that whoever believes in him, and that would be, of course, his work, shall not perish. It's going to change their life. They'll have eternal life. So while 16 is often quoted, 17, 18, and following are going to follow the logic of what the Father sent the Son to accomplish, but what he didn't send him to do. So verse 17 is contrastive. For God did not send the Son into the world to judge the world. So he sent the world, he sent his son into the world that the world would be saved. So the rest of the verse, 17, but that the world might be saved through him. So now the focus is on the one who believes. He who believes in him, as being the Son, is not judged. He who does not believe has been judged already, because he has not believed in the name of the only begotten Son. Once again, we see this. The only begotten Son of God. So the emphasis is on God's love, gave his Son. He did not send him to judge, because judgment's already been placed, has been judged already. So the world's condition is under judgment. Believing in Jesus is the alleviation of that judgment. So the world is already in judgment. The question is will they come out from underneath that judgment by believing in Jesus? So by looking at verse 19, this is the judgment. That the light has come into the world, and men love the darkness rather than the light, for their deeds were evil. For everyone who does evil hates the light and does not come to the light for fear that his deeds will be exposed. But he who practices the truth comes to the light, so that his deeds may be manifested as having been wrought in God. You'll see the break here, because after these things, and the question is, what are these things? But I'd like to illustrate for now that I'll make a break in the paragraph because it's something took place after the things above. And it's going to deal with Jesus and his disciples in a different location. So I want to set that aside for a moment because it's going to involve a conversation with John the Baptist. But I want to come back and I want to analyze a little bit more clearly this 14 and 15 for context to indicate, I wanted to demonstrate that I believe that this entire section is John the Apostle reflecting on the the love of God, which produced the gift of his only begotten Son, that those who believe have eternal life, but there is a judgment that needs to be dealt with. And I want to break 19 out because I want to look more specifically at this judgment. In chapter 1, it's already been described that Jesus was light, and it's the life of men. Saw at the beginning of John chapter 3 that Nicodemus had come to Jesus at night. It's interesting to see the contrast. That light has come into the world. It's possible that he has the story of Nicodemus in play. It just happened. And the contrast is the Pharisee, the representative, the ruler of the Jews, has come to Jesus. So the man comes to Jesus in the darkness and he comes into the light. So it's a revelation that he doesn't hate the light, but he comes into the light. So now this play on this light and dark, and it's surely not playful, it's very serious, but the use of the motifs of night when Nicodemus came to Jesus, Jesus being the light. John has further explained that this judgment that resides on man can only be removed if you believe. He has not believed in the name of the only begotten Son of God. So the only begotten Son of God is the light. He's come into the world. There's the incarnation. See this in John chapter 1. And men's response to that light is to stay in it, the darkness. For everyone who does evil hates the light and does not come to the light for fear their deeds will be exposed. The emphasis here is on exposure, and in the next verse, manifested. So they don't want their deeds exposed, they're afraid of it, but he who practices the truth. So the contrast, he who does evil hates the light, he who practices the truth comes to the light. So the contrast to be set up in verse 20 and 21 is a parallel. I'm going to drop it down just to illustrate. just these two verses. Now the conditions are everyone who does evil is contrasted in verse 21 with he who practices the truth, hates the light, comes to the light, does not come, and here's the reason, for fear that his deeds will be exposed. Notice the one who practices the truth comes to the light so that his deeds may be manifested as having been wrought in God. They're from God and they are praiseworthy. So the purpose of coming is without any doubt. It's not driven by fear. It's driven by desire. Quite a contrast. So by breaking out the two verses into separate categories here, actually these three, that we see the headers of light into the world, men loving the darkness rather than light, and their deeds were evil. And now the first one who is evil, the second who practices the truth. So combined, we see this as a parenthetical, this very deep explanation of explaining that on the heels of what Jesus has said about the Son of Man being lifted up, and by believing you'll have eternal life, John further explains with great detail that the evil that men do and the darkness that they live in is alleviated, is gone and reversed. If when the light has come into the world, they believe, then they will have eternal life. So the same themes in the first 18 verses of chapter 1 are now further explained. After these things, I would take this to refer both to or at least to the events of Nicodemus, after the events of the Passover feast and what Jesus did in the cleansing, capturing Nicodemus's attention. Jesus and his disciples came to the land of Judea, and there he was spending time with them and baptizing. John also was baptizing in Aenon near Salim, because there was much water there, and people were coming and were being baptized. Note this little notch here, this dash, for John had not yet been thrown into prison. That would eventually happen, but chronologically, at the time of the story, John was still free. At the time of the writing, everything was over. John had been imprisoned and beheaded. Jesus had died, had been raised from the dead. He ascended to the Father. So looking backward into history, John now explains, knowing that obviously everyone that knew of John the Baptist had known he had been thrown in prison. So he was still free here. Verse 25, therefore there arose a discussion on the part of John's disciples with a Jew, one person. Just note that. So John's disciples had a dispute or a discussion with a Jew about purification. This purification word, if you go back and consider the first 11 verses of chapter 2, the 6 stone water pots that were present at the wedding at Cana were for purification, Jewish purification. So here it comes up again. Water is a constant theme. We see it in John chapter 1. We see it again in the water turning into wine in John chapter 2. We see it now again, this idea of water. Jesus mentioned it with regard to the birth to Nicodemus. So the context of being baptized and purification, there was a dispute. Verse 26, and they came to John and said to him, Rabbi. We saw earlier the appeal that Nicodemus had made to Jesus, Rabbi. It's a teacher. So they came to John, Rabbi, he who was with you beyond the Jordan, to whom you have testified, behold, he is baptizing, and all are coming to him. John answered and said, a man can receive nothing unless it's been given him from heaven. You yourselves are my witnesses that I said, I am not the Christ. An earlier study reveals that John, in his first rebuttals to those who sought his identity, his first response, I am not the Christ, was his longest, 5 words. The next response, I am not, was 3, and then finally, no. So down to 1. He follows the same pattern with the same principle. But he's now adding a little bit, I have been sent ahead of him, verse 29. He who has the bride is the bridegroom, but the friend of the bridegroom who stands and hears him rejoices greatly because of the bridegroom's voice. So this joy of mine has been made full. And here's his thesis statement. He must increase, but I must decrease. So in the course of the discussion, I'm going to now consider that the New American Standard editors have making a break on a paragraph. And it makes sense because look at verse 31. He who comes from above is above all. He who is of the earth is from the earth and speaks of the earth. He who comes from heaven is above all. Very repetitive here, not in a bad way. He who comes from above is above all. He who comes from heaven is above all. So you might see this in a different sort of way, but he's changing gears because what John had said earlier, it's been given him from heaven, the introduction that someone is greater. This role that John is performing is that he is not the bridegroom. He is the friend of the bridegroom, so he's in a subordinate role. So with the dispute that they're coming to him, and they're all coming to him, John says, well, they should. He is from above. He has the bride, which in the theology of the New Testament, that's the church. But he, John, sees himself, John the Baptist, as a friend of the bridegroom, and he rejoices at the wedding because of the bridegroom's voice. So this joy of mine has been made full. Recognizing that Jesus was coming and that he had been sent ahead of him, now he steps beneath him in a diminishing role. So I want to make a break on the paragraph here, because this is a continuation of this idea of what is above and what is below. I'd like to illustrate in verse 31 how what is talked about is followed by something else. It returns to that, and it comes from, I want to break this out just to illustrate. I'll put this back together in just a moment. But I want to focus on verse 31. He who comes from above is above all. He who is of the earth, which is lower, is from the earth and speaks of the earth. 3 times the earth is mentioned. So if I could draw up kind of a comparison here, he who is of the earth is from the earth and speaks of the earth. And then I'll keep that on one line, but I want to introduce heaven again. He who comes from heaven is above all. You'll note there are 3 pronouns, all masculine, all third person, all followed by pronouns, talking about their origin and the recognition of supremacy. So he who comes from above. Once again, quotations leads us to believe that it's John the Baptist talking, but as I've mentioned earlier, very similar to what we see up above, it's possible that this is John the Apostle explaining more fully the sum and substance of what John had been saying about the simple idea, he must increase, but I must decrease. It's hard to know when the narrative changes or when the dialogue or the discourse is concluded. Very reasonable to consider that this is John the Apostle, and he's wrapping up the implication of what John the Baptist had said. The editors believe that this is John the Baptist. Evidently, they continue to use quotation marks. But by noticing this reference, the focus is that Jesus is above all, amplifying John's earlier point. So the people that are coming and having this dispute or this discussion about purification need to recognize that that has been surpassed. So the context would indicate, evidently, that Jesus' ministry and his baptism, although he wasn't baptizing anyone, but his ministry is from above. John acknowledges that. Now, John the Apostle does that in contrastive nature with he who is of the earth is from the earth and speaks of the earth. Well, John the Baptist did more than just speak of the earth. I believe that the reference here is reflecting back on this discussion and dispute about purification. And in the same way that John chapter 2 shows that the water of the Jewish ceremony of purification was eclipsed by the miracle of Jesus, the sign, the turning it into wine. So this idea of purification is of the earth. It's in the natural world, even though it's Jewish by nature, would be assumed to be of the law. It's still going to be surpassed by what is from above. So now, by contrast with earth, John continues, he who comes from heaven is above all. Now, focusing again on the he, which we'll take in context to be a reference to Jesus, there seems to be no change in verse 32, and I can go back and put this all back together. But just to keep it separate, I think for the course of study helps a focus here. What he has seen and heard, now it's not about his origin or comparison. Of that he testifies, and no one receives his testimony. Verse 33, he who has received his testimony has set his seal to this, that God is true. For he whom God has sent speaks the words of God, for he gives the Spirit without measure. The Father loves the Son and has given all things into his hand. He who believes in the Son has eternal life, but he who does not obey the Son will not see life, but the wrath of God abides on him. This section is different in its emphasis than what was being said up in this one, because this is the focus of the dispute that led John to say, he must increase, but I must decrease, further amplified by the comparison between above, earth, and heaven. And now the focus is on the Father having sent the Son, and the Son has everything. So he gives the Spirit without measure. The Father loves the Son and has given all things into his hand. So everything resides in the Son in such a way that he who believes in him has eternal life. Sounds just like John 3:16. But he who does not obey the Son will not see life, but the wrath of God abides on him. Sounds just like John chapter 3, verses 17 and 18. So I want to draw this out as a further conclusion, verse 36 in particular, that this stands not alone, but contextually it is very similar in style and in emphasis as is 17 through 18. So I believe these to be a fitting conclusion to John chapter 3. Once again, I want to emphasize that here in John 3:36, he who believes in the Son has eternal life and is thereby saved. He who does not obey, this is to be understood to believe and obey the Son, will not see life, but the wrath of God abides on him. Taken consistently, up in verse, taking that verse consistently with verse 18, he who believes is not judged, he who does not has been judged already, is to say the same thing. That is, men are already under judgment because of their sin and because of the darkness. They prefer darkness over light. If they do not believe, the judgment, as John chapter 3 verse 36 says, abides on him. They remain under the judgment. John chapter 3 verses 16 through 36 are some of the most important emphases in the Gospel of John. It puts in the center, following on the heels of Nicodemus and then another discourse between John the Baptist and the people who came to him wondering about his ministry. Without question, these two sections emphasize that there is no other option but Jesus Christ who can save men. Without him, one remains in darkness and one remains under judgment. But the Father, who loved the world, gave his only begotten Son, that whosoever believes will have eternal life. This chapter is the strongest in explaining what happens when you believe and what happens if you don't.